Something is shifting in the tech world right now, and most people haven't noticed it yet. It's not happening through headlines or sudden announcements. It's happening quietly, underneath the surface of the devices and platforms you use every day. For decades, Microsoft's dominance was built on one core idea: control the operating system, and you control the entire computing experience. Windows became the standard for personal computing, not because there were no alternatives, but because it created an ecosystem that was extremely difficult to leave. Software compatibility, enterprise dependencies, and user familiarity all reinforce that position. But that model is no longer as stable as it once was. The reason comes down to a fundamental change in how computing works. The operating system is no longer the center of everything. Instead, the real power has shifted to the cloud, to platforms, and to services that run independently of any single OS. And in this new environment, Linux has become the foundation in ways that directly challenge the traditional role of Windows. Right now, the majority of the internet runs on Linux-based systems. This is not speculation, it's a widely documented industry reality. From web servers to cloud infrastructure, Linux dominates because it offers flexibility, performance, and most importantly, control. Companies are not locked into a single vendor's ecosystem. They can modify, optimize, and scale Linux in ways that proprietary systems simply don't allow. This is where the pressure on Microsoft begins to build. Because when the infrastructure layer shifts away from your platform, your influence starts to weaken. Microsoft recognized this early, which is why it made a major strategic pivot toward cloud computing. Azure became a central part of its business, and interestingly, a large portion of workloads on Azure now run on Linux rather than Windows. Think about what that means. The company that built its empire on Windows is now supporting and profiting from a competing foundation. That's not panic in the traditional sense, but it is a clear signal of strategic pressure. And this pressure doesn't stop at the cloud. Developers, the people who actually build software, are increasingly working in Linux-based environments. Modern development tools, containerization technologies like Docker, and orchestration platforms like Kubernetes are all deeply tied to Linux ecosystems. These tools define how software is built and deployed today. So even when an application ends up running on Windows, there's a strong chance it was built, tested, and optimized in a Linux environment. Over time, that changes priorities. When developers are more comfortable in Linux, they start designing systems that are platform agnostic or Linux first. That reduces dependency on Windows and gradually shifts the center of gravity away from it. Microsoft's response to this was not to resist, but to integrate. The introduction of the Windows subsystem for Linux was a major move. It allows developers to run Linux environments directly within Windows. On the surface, it looks like a feature. But strategically, it reflects something deeper, Microsoft acknowledging that it cannot afford to lose developers to Linux entirely, because if developers leave, the ecosystem follows. Now let's bring Android into this picture because the situation becomes even more interesting. Android is often seen as separate from Linux, but at its core, it runs on the Linux kernel. That means billions of devices around the world are already powered by a form of Linux. However, Google maintains tight control over the Android ecosystem through services, app distribution, and proprietary layers on top of that kernel. So while Linux is present, it is not independent in the way it is on servers or desktops. But here's where things begin to shift. There is growing interest, especially among developers and some manufacturers, in creating alternatives that reduce dependence on Google's ecosystem. This includes custom Android forks, open-source mobile operating systems, and experiments with Linux-based mobile platforms that operate outside of Google's control. None of these have replaced Android, but they signal something important: the desire for independence is increasing. And that's the core theme behind what some are calling a Linux uprising. It's not a sudden takeover. It's a gradual expansion into every layer of computing. Linux dominates servers. It powers the cloud. It sits underneath Android. It runs embedded systems, smart devices, and even parts of automotive platforms. So the question is no longer whether Linux is growing. The question is how far that growth can go. One area where this becomes very visible is hardware. Devices are becoming less dependent on traditional operating systems. Chromebooks are a clear example. They run on Chrome OS, which is built on Linux, and they rely heavily on web applications rather than native software. In education and lightweight computing environments, they have already carved out a significant space. What this shows is that many users don't actually need a full Windows environment anymore. If your work happens in a browser, the underlying operating system becomes less important, and that weakens one of Windows' biggest historical advantages. At the same time, enterprises are reevaluating their infrastructure decisions. Cost is a major factor. Licensing fees for proprietary systems can scale quickly, especially for large organizations. Linux-based systems often provide more flexibility in how they are deployed and managed. That doesn't mean they're always cheaper in every scenario, but they offer more control over costs and customization. Security is another consideration. Because Linux is open source, organizations can audit the code, modify it, and respond to vulnerabilities in ways that are not possible with closed systems. In an era where cybersecurity threats are increasing, that level of control becomes more valuable. This is particularly relevant for governments and public sector organizations. Several countries have explored or implemented Linux-based systems in certain areas of their infrastructure. The motivation is straightforward: reduce dependence on external vendors, improve transparency, and maintain greater control over critical systems. Again, this is not a complete replacement of Windows or Android, but it is a shift in how decisions are being made. Now, let's address the biggest claim in the title: the idea that this could end Windows and Android. Taken literally, that is not happening. Windows remains deeply embedded in enterprise environments. Many industries rely on legacy applications that are built specifically for Windows. Replacing those systems would require significant time, cost, and risk. Android, on the other hand, continues to dominate the global smartphone market. Its scale, app ecosystem, and hardware diversity make it extremely difficult to displace. But ending doesn't always mean disappearance. It can also mean losing dominance, and that's where the real story is. For years, Windows and Android have operated as gatekeepers. If you wanted to build or distribute software at scale, you had to operate within their ecosystems. That gave Microsoft and Google significant influence over how computing evolved. Linux changes that dynamic. Because it exists outside of a single company's control, it creates an alternative path. Developers, companies, and even governments can build systems that are not tied to a specific vendor. That reduces dependency, and when dependency decreases, control weakens. From Microsoft's perspective, this is why adaptation has become critical. The company has expanded far beyond Windows. Cloud services, enterprise solutions, and subscription-based products are now central to its business model. Windows is still important, but it is no longer the sole foundation of the company's success. This diversification is not accidental. It is a response to the changing landscape. Google is also adapting, though in different ways. While Android remains dominant, the company has explored new operating system concepts like Fuchsia. This suggests an awareness that the current model may need to evolve over time, especially as new types of devices and use cases emerge. So when people talk about a Linux uprising, what they are really describing is a redistribution of power, not a collapse, not a sudden takeover, but a steady shift. Linux is becoming the default foundation in more areas of computing, while Windows and Android are becoming layers on top rather than the core itself. And that distinction matters, because the closer Linux gets to the foundation, the more influence it gains over how systems are built and how they interact. For everyday users, this shift may not feel dramatic. You can still use Windows, you can still use Android. Your experience may not change overnight. But behind the scenes, the systems that power your apps, your data, and your services are increasingly running on Linux-based infrastructure. And over time, that shapes the direction of the entire industry. The narrative of panic is easy to understand. It creates urgency, it grabs attention, but the reality is more calculated. What we are seeing is not panic, it's pressure. Pressure to adapt. Pressure to integrate. Pressure to remain relevant in a world where control is no longer centralized. Linux is not replacing everything overnight, but it is expanding into positions that were once tightly controlled by a few major players. And as that expansion continues, the balance of power shifts. Windows doesn't disappear, but it loses exclusivity. Android doesn't collapse, but it faces increasing alternatives. And Linux continues to grow, not because it is forced into place, but because it fits the direction computing is already moving toward. So the real story isn't about an ending. It's about a transition. A transition from closed ecosystems to more open foundations, from centralized control to distributed influence, from dominance to competition. And once that transition reaches a certain point, it becomes very difficult to reverse. That's the moment where pressure turns into something more permanent. Not panic in the emotional sense, but a recognition that the rules have changed. And in this new set of rules, Linux is no longer on the outside. It's at the center of everything.